I think we're moving away from insanely high fidelity graphics, chat. I had a funny observation. Also, we were just talking during dinner. I think one of the contributing factors why Final Fantasy also has been decreasing in popularity over the years with FF16 and like Rebirth is also the fact that graphics don't exactly matter as much. And Final Fantasy as an overall series, as an overall existence, like the whole point of it, every new Final Fantasy game is gonna blow your balls off visually. All the way up until Final Fantasy 15 has that been true. And even if
Gotcha. Well, that is actually very true. I totally agree with that, right? Like, I remember getting Final Fantasy VII on the PS1, and right, the N64 was already out. But the reason Final Fantasy VII, as crude as the 3D models were, it was such a fantastic game for the graphics that were being pushed at the time, right? So we're gonna have to put our thinking caps on here, because everything's gonna have to be in terms of relativity. When Final Fantasy VII came out and did its thing, it was just a master class in like, this is what we can do with games moving forward. As soon as Final Fantasy VIII came out, it put Final Fantasy VII graphically on the back burner, because 8 took it up that much further. 9 was unique and one of the most beloved. 9 was unique because it brought back that graphic power of the PS1 with high fantasy, right? There's a lot of fantastical elements kind of paying homage back to Final Fantasy's roots. Of course, 10 and 10.2 are notorious for just how great those games were and how much they just like really defined that era of gaming, right, with the PS2. And then you moved further along. For me personally, then we got to the PS3, and you got 13 and like that whole series, and then Final Fantasy 14 and all that. So it's like every console generation like leapt, right? That's what you came to expect from the Final Fantasy series. And it's right up until like the more recent or modern era, right, with like 16 and the remake series.
FF7 remake, to a certain degree, that shit was true, where it's like, oh my
crazy.
God, the upgrade from the previous system to this one, holy shit, bro. Like, Final Fantasy is the game that you buy to like justifies my console existence. Like, I buy this because look how good it looks. Like, holy shit. Final Fantasy has always gotten a lot of sales based on that relationship where people just don't give a shit about Final Fantasy, but it'll pick people up and get them to play because it's just visually gorgeous.
Yeah, like I remember the trailer for Final Fantasy VII like way back in the day, right? And it's getting national attention, right? These commercials, these spots are trying to make it cool, the cinematics, and they're really drawing on all of that to say, look what you can do with a PlayStation, right? So there's that symbiosis between here's the product and it's going to sell the console, which explains a lot of why, you know, for the longest, Square Enix has had exclusivity, or Squaresoft back in the day, with Sony and the games that get produced.
Pitching is that graphics are obviously great, obviously beautiful, obviously makes you feel like, oh, my system is worth it. This console generation specifically, I don't feel like graphics are selling games anymore, because some of the games that all of a sudden just like explode and are on top, like all of a sudden through virality and whatnot, are good looking games, but are they like the Uncharted's or something like that that really pushed visuals and all this kind of shit? Not really. Like, the virality of certain games sort of blows up. It is due to other reasons other than just straight visuals. So
yeah, like, see, so that's very true, right? Like, you have a lot of games that graphically are just not pushing the envelope. What was it? Or Vampire Survivor, I think, which I forgot the name. Then you have to a lesser extent like Power World, right? Because there is more like graphical fidelity in there, but it's not like stretching the imagination, as it were. There's all kinds of games that fall into that category where they have done like just increasingly magnificently well, right, in terms of their sales and a player base that, you know, surrounds the game. So graphics aren't everything, but I do think that they still play their part. And, you know, the PlayStation 5 in particular is in a very weird spot. We talked about this before. Yes, it should be pushing the envelope with what the hardware can do. The problem is that there's a lot of things that have happened over the years since the release of that console, and everything hasn't panned out all that well, especially for these AAA studios. I think the real problem comes into play, though, is that everybody is trying to push the envelope, seemingly at this point, with graphical fidelity, and that's just never been the case on any console, really, right? Like, there's space for all kinds of games.
Now you get clearly amazing looking games, which is Rebirth and 16. Gorgeous games, like, looks shit, ridiculous, dude. But they don't perform as well because people just aren't in it for the visuals anymore. And then you get something like Elden Ring. And I like this comparison. I'm going to be real. Elden Ring is a gorgeous game, but I just
I was just thinking about what he was saying there. Like, the games aren't selling as well because the graphics just aren't as important anymore. Like the premise behind that is they would just sell because the game looks great. And to an extent, I think you have a more savvy player base, right? Like, we've grown up with these games, so that expectation, at least from this generation of gamer, right, like up in the 30s and stuff like that, where there's a little more to be interested in. Some of these games, not all of them, but if we're just hanging out with the RPGs in particular, it's kind of interesting where they land, because you have games like Elden Ring that have a lot of hours sunk into them, but at the same time, these experiences with particular stories don't. And I wonder if that's just because of the perception of the freedom of choice in the play, more so than just, you know, the graphics just don't sell it anymore. Because to an extent, yes, Elden Ring isn't the most graphically intense game, but it still is, right? Like, if I put this game beside an original copy of Demon Souls, you're going to see the graphical fidelity. But then the art style, like, it pushes it over and it doesn't have to do much. But I wonder if that's less about the graphics and more just about the perception of what can actually take place in this game. Like, are linear stories, or are stories still the thing that will help sell a game, or does everything need to be more of a sandbox at this point, is what I'm asking.
At the gameplay trailer, and that bitch ass game is not graphically impressive, bro. They're like doing all these zoom ins and tight shots of shit. Like, yeah, this game is kind of rough visually. Most games now, like, yeah, this game is kind of rough visually.
Yeah, like, look at this. Right? Like, there's no textures on here. Like, you would need a modder to come in and really up all of these details, right? These polygons and stuff in here. So it's absolutely right. Like, if you zoom in on this, like, it is not impressive at all.
And I'm like, yeah, this game is kind of rough visually. Most games now, if you like zoom in so much and it still looks good and it's like that's important about the game, no. Games like Elden Ring and even especially FF7 Rebirth to a certain degree, you zoom in on with a microscope and you get this close and you're like, wow, this game looks like shit. But then you go back from here and you're like, whoa, this game's gorgeous. Like, even
that's Zelda, so true. That's like, if you like, because I'm messing around, like, Street Fighter's got Akuma and everything, right? So when you're actually like in the actual matches themselves, like all of the detail, like on the muscles and everything, like all of those graphical details, like veins popping out the neck and the sweat beads and all that, is wild. Like it's the most beautiful Street Fighter game that has come out, right? But when you zoom in and you look at like the hair and like the kind of like the frizz and the anti-aliasing that is innate to the game, you're like, man, this doesn't look all that hot, right? So, it's totally true. And like you said, like that's something in particular that takes place with Zelda, right? Like if you play Breath of the Wild, anything like that, like from a back, it looks great. If you put mods on it, it looks like, how is this even possible? Once you get up close though, you realize, yeah, this is like the Wind Waker.
Wild is that shit where it's like, back from here, this game's gorgeous. Zoom in, this game looks like fucking trash, dude. I don't think we need to do this anymore, personally. For a lot of these games with these big worlds and all this crazy shit that's in them, I don't think we need to just peer into every corner, every facet. It's making games take way too long to come out. If there is a problem with this current era in the industry that I personally hate, why the hell are games taking 4 to 7 years to come out? That is where shit needs to change. We do not need that extra fidelity. We don't. Where you...
So, yeah. That, like, is chasing graphical fidelity the reason that games are taking much longer to release? Because that's a premise, right? Now, like I've watched a video before that talked about some of the behind the scenes from a successful developer about why it's taking some of these games so long to come out. And at least in that conversation, what it boiled down to was accountability. It was specific, a lack of accountability rather than chasing graphical fidelity, right? Because even in this clip here, like this very quick clip, there's like some, you know, focusing, some LOD kind of things taking place. Like it's not the cleanest thing, but it works. Like we're having this conversation because Hellblade 2 just dropped, right? And the controversy surrounding that game is, you know, it taking 5 years of development or whatever, and like its graphical fidelity is stellar, but people are like, but where's my gameplay? Right? So it took 5 years. I really don't have a lot of gameplay, but it looks nice, but you didn't make a game. Like that's the argument. And so when Max says that, I'm just not, it puts the conversation on, if they just stop putting so much into the graphic fidelity, we would get our games faster. And while I think in general that's true, I don't know if that speeds the game up by like, you know, 2 to 3 years or something of the sort for that reason alone, especially when now that even though everybody is hearing about it, now that tools like AI and things like that are coming into play, I wonder how much easier it would be to actually get that same level of quality, but allowing, you know, AI to fill in details while like you go and create like the silhouette of the environment or the character that you want to build.
Spend so much money on this shit. You're effectively 7, 8 days, 9 days, 12 days into your Lethal Company profit quota. And you're the Spider-Man 2 devs looking at that profit quota. And it's like, well, it cost us so much money to get here. And where are we at? We have to make that much fucking money on this shit. And we don't hit the quota. Now people are laid off. Even though you had like a banger of a run. Your game was incredible. It's like, this is not a functioning business anymore. This doesn't work out this way, dude. Through the looking glass at every single tiny bit and piece of everything. It isn't fun for us. It doesn't add any actual element to the game. I don't think it's necessary. I really don't. I think the majority of games do not need to do that shit.
Well, and I agree with that preface, right? He said the majority of games. And that's where, for me, that's what I highlight where that ship lands, right? Like if I look at these clips here with Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth and all that, right? Like seeing like the way that the body language and the facial animations and things like that, they lend really well for what they're trying to achieve. Do I think that you need to be doing facial reconstruction and like Helldivers, for example? No, right? That's why they have the helmets kind of thing. So in that sense, yes. What I would say overall is what we're looking at is a problem of entrepreneurs not taking advantage of the marketplace, right? At least not in mass, because AAA titles, depending on what they're trying to do, I think it's fine. I think it's even more than fine. It actually does lend itself to the fun that you have with the game. I think the problem is, again, getting back to investors, having so many projects focused solely on investors means you need to turn a profit, which means they're going to want to see something not as creative. And so they're going to land on the things that they think works. And so you have way too many games trying to crank out max settings when it's proven time and again that you actually don't need that in order to make a successful title. It's too many hands in the pot that actually don't know what makes a game fun or the degree of things that make games fun.
They don't, and they shouldn't be doing that shit. To be real, you know what games are also like that? And they really kind of fall apart when you get that close to things. Almost all of Capcom games in RE Engine. You really look like, take a sniper scope with Leon and RE4 and zoom in and look at little spots. And you're like, this looks like shit. This actually kind of looks sort of bad. But from the natural perspective the game presents to you, it's fucking beautiful. It's beautiful. Seemingly, Capcom has gotten Dragon's Dogma 2 is, yeah, I'd imagine no exception, even though we didn't really look at that game too much. All I'm saying is that Capcom has seemingly found a pretty decent balance. You know what game's also like that? Monster Hunter World. Monster Hunter World is the same shit. That game is fucking butt ugly when you stop and you just look at one spot. It's fucking butt ugly. But when you're running and doing things, it's gorgeous. Dude, this shit is awesome. Oh my God.
Right. And that's like, in total, that's what the graphic fidelity really boils down to, right? Like if you stop and you just have something sitting there, how great does it look as like a wallpaper versus how does it look when you're actually playing the game? For me, that's how you hone in on fidelity and crank it up a notch, because it's true. There are many games where you can stop and you just focus on an area or an aspect. Not only are the like the details kind of lacking, like you'll start to see like the glitches of things taking place, right? Some just wild jank happening with the graphics. But when you step back, you're moving around, right? Like the art direction combined with the graphic fidelity lends itself to an experience that is unmatched. That's what Elden Ring is. That's what like all of those types of games now that are really enjoyed are. What's another one like that? Hades is like that, right? Supergiant does great like that. Are their graphics like over the top? No, but they have enough of the graphics in there, so they're still doing something with it, but they're leaning more on their art direction. Because I can take even for somewhere, I can take Hades and put it up beside Bastion, right? I think their first game. I love that game, but you can see the graphic difference between them, as well as the art direction that's taken.
Awesome. That's what I'm saying. It is an old engine. It's an old ass game on like a decade plus old engine, but they were able to pump out the best selling Capcom game ever on technically old visuals. Now I go back and I look at it and it's like the Switch is the best example of that. You know, even Monster Hunter Rise looks like an upscaled fucking PSP game at times. And it sold a shit ton. And it's insanely rough.
The Switch sells crazy amounts of copies of their games, despite the fact that they are not top tier graphics within the industry. However, their graphics are better than the Wii U.
Looking, and I forgot about the visuals of Monster Hunter World when I was playing Rise, just because it was like, well, this is great. So anyway, related to Final Fantasy, all I'm saying is that Final Fantasy is a franchise that has sort of been based on the fact that every single new Final Fantasy is going to blow your balls off with its graphics and make you feel like you spent that $400 to $500 on your console. We're going to make it worth it, bro. From the PS1 to the PS2 to the fucking PS3, even the PS4. To be real, FF7 Remake and Final Fantasy 15, you're like, god damn, dude, yeah, holy shit, this feels like a big upgrade over PS3 shit. Hell yeah, this is pretty cool. Now, we have the smallest amount of return investment on newer consoles compared to the previous one, man.
And I think that plays more of a part because of the access, the access to the systems that you can use to play games, right? And then the amount of games that you have available at your disposal. Like even if we stay again with Final Fantasy as Max is doing, the amount of games that you could play when Final Fantasy VII came out are paltry in comparison to the amount of games that you can choose to play with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, right? Like it just came out. There's way more pulling on your attention, asking for your attention than even back then. And that's playing a part as well. And again, I think it boils down to how is this being fed to the consumer? Because yeah, we don't need all of that, particularly on the PlayStation anymore, even from the perspective of the PC, which I think has a lot of contributory factors as well to graphics more and more needing or to be pushed, right? Like the 5090, the 5080. Well, you don't want to see PS3 graphics and you bought a 5090, right? You want to be able to crank that shit all the way up to max, and you want to see some lumen, you want to see all kinds of crazy ray tracing, path tracing nonsense happening in the game. Now, it may seem more like a niche factor in market, but man, people want that stuff even when they're playing on a 1050. So there is an element to where gamers are still wanting graphics to be cranked up, and at the same time, they just don't want them to be in the way of the gameplay. And so this is where the disconnect is happening, not because graphics themselves being cranked up are inherently just bad, but it's that we have more developers, right? More teams, more people making games that don't have the best interest of the player in mind. And so now the graphics are hung out, right, as a scapegoat because people think that alone, right? Oh, it looks great. To his point earlier, it looks great, so they're going to buy it. When it's like, no, the graphics being cranked up have to be tastefully done because it's going to add to the immersion. Like think Crysis back in the day.
The amount of shit that has effectively changed from the previous generation to this generation to an actual relative perception is mad low. It is big, don't get me wrong. Load times and how that impacts the overall game experience is profound. SSDs, in my opinion, are where this shit shines.
Yeah, I'm just going to say here, like if you've if you've ever taken like even a game that, like for example, like Breath of the Wild I have on the Wii U, okay? To get the way that I want to play that game, I have it on Cemu. The difference in how that plays, because it's effectively running off of the SSD, even in that emulation state, is wild. Versus what happens, I put them side by side and just, I'm playing the game, right? Get to a loading point, start playing. Then I look at it on the Wii U, get to a loading point. I'm still waiting, but now I'm over here playing the game while I'm waiting for it to load over there. So yeah, that changes the scope of everything. And that is a boon for gaming moving forward. It's part of the process of even graphics on the back end, right? That lends itself to saying, hey, it's not as shiny, but it's putting in like a crazy amount of work. And really that's why graphics, as far as the visual fidelity, have been able to be cranked up, because without that, it's just too slow.
That shit is amazing. But to be real, all of the extra time and effort going into raw visual fidelity is not worth the time or the return of investment from the previous generation to this one. It's just not worth it. It doesn't feel like anything has really changed that much. This generation is really disappointing just in general. The only way that it's not disappointing is in SSDs, is in fast-ass loading, and now we can change our games to play different.
Okay, so here's where I think it has been disappointing for this generation of games, and what should have been the technical leap. And a lot of that hangs on ray tracing, because even on the PC side of things, more of a focus was given to lighting, which there are some baked in lighting solutions that are fantastic, right? But like real time ray tracing, real time path tracing was promised for like the future of gaming. Like even on consoles, people were expecting more of that stuff, and it didn't happen. Here we are in 2024, and games are still being played on old Xboxes, less now, but in PS4s. I think that the next generation, in a lot of, and mind you, because with all the stuff that go on there, they're still gonna hang on visuals because of AI and all that kind of stuff. I think the next move for graphics should go backwards. Does anyone remember PhysX? Right, like the way that the environments interacted with the hardware because of that, like that suite of tools. You had some amazing opportunities in games to change and really amplify and make better the experience of what was happening, right? The gunplay, sliding animations from like rocks or mountains and all that kind of stuff. Those are things that are like really tangible that people can feel, and it got traded out for lighting. Okay. And that's great, because that's what you use to make things look more realistic within a runtime environment, the way that like ray tracing is doing it. But to the point here, how much more would be done, say even in a game like Elden Ring, if more of the focus was like, okay, we got our graphics baked in, right? But now let's double down on the PhysX technology and, you know, come up with some crazy, you know, nonsense that's happening within the game, even more than what it already does, right? These kind of realistic interpretations of physical interactions. That might be what the industry does in turn. I mean, it's still there. That hardware got abandoned very quickly for, you know, what we have now. But I do agree to some extent there are way too many games that are trying to give that visual fidelity when it's not necessary. And when you have awesome games that are more, simplistic over the years in those terms, where they just popped off and people could not stop playing them, in the most part because of just the interaction with other people. And that itself, I think, lends more to anything else. The fidelity of the game isn't what's causing the development time to run so long. I think it's more that there are developers who just literally don't know what they're doing. And not knowing what you're doing, you have less people then who want to be accountable for fixing the problem. And so that's why a lot of these studios are also always outsourcing things to get them done, because they're not getting them done in-house. So these things get pushed further and further and further back. And what gets scapegoated? Well, the visual fidelity. Why? Because when you have to turn around and show an investor any progress you've made, well, it's hard to say we've made progress and you give them lines of code. They don't know what that is or what that means. But you turn around and you say, oh, this is the store that we've created. This is the plan on monetization. Oh, and by the way, here's what the character looks like. And here's what they looked like before. And so that's where this time management of the project, I think, is where this really lands for why games are taking so long to come out and why you don't see a return on investment when the game is released. Because even though the games, some of them are fun and great, maybe it's with the marketing or with the reach or the platform or whatever have may be, it's not working out. But I think it's a bit too much to say that it's square on the shoulders of the graphics taking so long, therefore it's not worth it. I think in the end, they need to do better on presenting to the public what it is that they're going to be getting and getting them excited for that. Or make the case this is what this game is and then be excited for that experience. Because if we just stick with Hellblade 2, no matter where you sit on the fence with that, it's never a good thing when so many people come out and are like, this is a walking simulator. They expected something else. And so we really have to get to, well, why did they expect something else?
Because of fast loading. I think that is 100% worth it. If we're talking about just like, oh, am I super enthused about my PS5 or Next box over the previous one? Fuck no, dude. Absolutely not. There is still only one game on my PS5 that I emphatically feel is a substantial, massive upgrade from the previous generation. There's only one game I still fire it up and go, holy sweet dumb hell. Right there. It's this launch game. So to me, it's like, from what I've played personally,
do they have that on PC? I don't think so. I saw
one
thing to release that on PC.
Update, right, a substantial update from the previous generation. What I'm saying is that I don't think it's worth it. I think it's good that these games are running better, but is it worth it for these games to take like 5 to 6 years to exist? To put in every goddamn amount of effort, detail, developer time, concept art, all of this shit into the microscopic goddamn details of every single room? And I don't think it's worth it, man. I don't think it adds anything to the game either. For most developers to effectively throw...
It definitely isn't worth it. Especially in terms of the console space, right? Because if you take 7 years to develop the game, at least back in the day, you've already moved on to another console. So in some ways, right? Like, that you're already making your game for the PlayStation 6 in the midst of the PlayStation 5. So on a console perspective, absolutely not. Regardless of which way you think about it, because you're on different architecture and hardware, and the marketing and all of that kind of stuff plays a part. Like, I remember, so Twilight Princess was a GameCube to Wii situation. And the Breath of the Wild was Wii to Wii U. So like that played a part, because now we're so deep into the development of this. Well, we might as well release it for the next console. But in all purposes, we also kind of have like an inferior product that we're releasing because it's on the older hardware. So, and all of the graphics isn't just from a visual perspective. Some of that is like just how big the game is and how that hardware can handle the logistics of that runtime. And so you come up with that, whereas at least on a PC or the computer setup, I mean, you might have, Windows, 7 to Windows 8 or something like that, but nowhere near the kind of change or a thing that you have to account for like between consoles.
Throw out a game because it's so expensive to do this shit now. The game has to sell a shit ton or else the studio is sunk. So it's like, hey, we're gonna do this, and if it works, we're really gonna be in it, or if it doesn't work, we're fucking dead. That sort of a mentality leads an industry to take no risks. We can't take any risks anymore. We lost this, we lost that, we fucked up here, we fucked up there. That leads us to an industry that is not creative.
And he's absolutely right. It's because they don't know what they're doing. Too much focus on suit and tie and not enough on, hey, they've already been doing this. It is still an art form. It is still a team project. They are still needing to take chances in order to make something successful, right? It's like in Hollywood when you get the same formula over and over and over again. Why? Because investors want a sure return on their funds. And so you rehash the same thing, even though it's not necessarily helping that particular project. And that's what happens to games. Cranking up the visual fidelity in every game is not helping every game. It doesn't make a bad game good. It can make a good game better, but it will never make a bad game good. And so using that premise, they keep sinking their money into projects that keep losing them their money. It's a vicious cycle.
Creativity is now not encouraged. You just have to be safe and do this one thing that we know is going to work. Game industry is made by creative people. The truly great games that are out there are made by creative people. It's the same thing for every goddamn thing. The stuff that we love so much is not made at a board meeting. It's made by people who have a fucking vision, and they get everybody in line with their vision and they execute within limited periods of time. Movie industries like that. The game industries like that. Everything's like that with larger scale development. Not a factory, all I'm saying is that Nintendo, but they're making it one. All companies seemingly is coming out on top now because they sort of get it. They knew they did not have to push graphical fidelity, and people still invested heavily in Nintendo even now.
It's so true. Hey, and when they did, what was that, Pokemon Violet or whatever, like, because they didn't really understand like what it would take to produce that game well and push for the Switch, the graphical envelope, it was a bad release. Like, it was terrible. But Nintendo has always had this down pat. Now, mind you, later in the development cycle, they started doing some cooking, man. Like, Day of Reckoning 2 on the GameCube looks fantastic. I still love the way that game looks after all these years. Then you have Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 had no business looking as good as it did on the GameCube, despite the fact that it was the inferior console when it came to the raw power for graphic fidelity. But they cranked it out, and it was awesome. So they still do that on the side of Nintendo. It's just not as much, to the point because they realize that for them, they are focused more on the experience, right? I'm sure they could make Smash Brothers look far more realistic with lighting and all that kind of stuff. They'd just rather not. They'd rather spend that money to put maybe different IPs, licenses, games, those characters in the game.
Now with their next generation, they're moving to something potentially PS4 Pro in terms of visuals. Clearly their workload's going to get much bigger, but dude, they're going to be in a spot where game development was at like 10 years ago. And it's going to look way better, don't get me wrong, but still, their choice to put out games isn't because they're taking forever to make. It's because that's just the way Nintendo fucking works. They do whatever the hell they want. They don't give a shit. They're just going to do what they want when they want, you know?
That is true. Nintendo does what Nintendo wants. But I'll put a link to this video down in the comments. I love Max's content on here. Just want to chime into this this conversation. Do graphics sell games anymore? I think it depends on the audience, to be quite honest with you. Because if we're talking about a PC audience, yes, it does. But does it primarily sell games? Not so much, because you could get somebody with a 4090 that then wants to go and play, you know, the most basic looking thing, or someone in my position where I went and upgraded my rig, but I primarily am focused on wanting to play games that I just didn't have the opportunity to play from before. I mean, those games came out in 2015, 2013, but I know that my hardware now is going to allow me to play the games from back then that pushed the envelope. But yeah, I mean, I think graphics still have their part to play. I think it's still important. I would hope that moving forward, more games decide to focus on the visual clarity when it comes to the art direction. And I don't think that this necessarily has to be the case in the AAA department, but it undoubtedly has to be the space where you're talking, you know, AA and indie development and things of that nature. Like, the path to victory is not paved in needing to sell out to make the most intense, realistic looking game. It just needs to be one that people are going to quite enjoy. And then add that back in if you have the time. Hey, or for me, maybe that's an upgrade path, right? Release the game, and if it's great and it does numbers, then say, hey, this is what we really envisioned, and then push that out and see how it goes.